Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on cross-examination. My name is Ashton Smith. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, and I debated there for 4 years.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristina. I'm a recent graduate at Wayne State University where I debated for 2.5 years. Go Warriors. Ashton and I are here today to talk to you about what cross-examination or cross-ex is and why it's important to have cross-ex in debates. Today we will go over why cross-ex writ large is important, the do's of asking and answering questions and the don'ts of asking and answering questions, and we'll finish up our presentation by talking about why the way you act or your decorum in cross-ex is important. So what is cross-ex? It is essentially the part of popular understanding of what you think happens in debate. It's a moment after a speech where the opposing team gets to ask the previous speaker about things that they just said in their speech. So, for example, when someone speaks, they then are examined on the arguments that they make. Cross-examination lasts for 3 minutes and occurs after every constructive speech. As you've learned, there are 4 constructive speeches, 2 for the affirmative team and 2 for the negative team. So, for example, after the 1AC, the negative team will ask questions about what the affirmative does, and after the 1NC, the affirmative team will ask questions about what the negative stance is. Ashton will teach you later on in our presentation how to brainstorm how you should ask these questions and what the purpose of asking questions is. Cross-ex has to happen after every constructive speech, even if you don't understand what's going on. This is exemplified in one of my favorite movies, which is Clueless. However, unlike in the movie, if your opponent says things that you do not understand or that they don't complete the assignment, you can't give up in the middle of the debate. You should use cross-ex as a time to regroup and steer the debate in the direction that you want. Let's watch.
I don't know why Dion's going out with a high school boy. They're like dogs. You have to clean them and feed them, and they're just like these nervous creatures that jump and slobber all over you. Ew! Get off of me! As if.
Should all oppressed people be allowed refuge in America? Amber will take the con position. Cher will be pro. Cher, 2 minutes.
So, okay. Like right now, for example, the Haitians need to come to America. But some people are all, what about the strain on our resources? But it's like when I had this garden party for my father's birthday, right? I said RSVP because it was a sit-down dinner. But people came that did not RSVP. So I was totally bugging. I had to haul ass to the kitchen, redistribute the food, squish in extra place settings. But by the end of the day, it was the more the merrier. And so, if the government could just get to the kitchen, rearrange some things, we could certainly party with the Haitians. And in conclusion, may I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty.
Amber, reply.
Mr. Hall, how can I answer that? The topic is Haiti, and she's talking about some little party.
Hello, it was his 50th birthday.
Whatever. If she doesn't do the assignment, I can't do mine.
So, it's also important to understand when you're doing cross-ex who is asking questions. Much like the order of the speeches in a debate, there's also an order to who asks the cross-ex questions. They are as follows, or you can use this sheet to understand how to determine if you're supposed to answer cross-ex questions. When there's 4 people in a debate, that means there's 4 options. First, you're the person who just spoke. If you just spoke, that means you're asking questions, or you are answering the questions that are being asked. The second is if you are on the same team as the person who just spoke, you are not required to answer questions. However, you are allowed to help your partner answer questions if they indicate that they need help during the debate. If you're on the opposing team and you are preparing to give this speech after the constructive that was just given, you should prep for your speech and you should not worry about answering or asking the cross-ex questions. But if you are on the opposing team and not about to give a speech, it is your turn to ask questions and you need to make sure that you're ready. For example, after the 1EC, it is the job of the 2N on the negative team to ask the 1A questions. Or after the 1N seat, it is the job of the 1A on the affirmative team to ask the 1N questions about the negative strategy. At the end of the day, though, you can just remember that if you're giving the next speech, if you're not giving the next speech after your opponent is done speaking, then you need to be ready to answer or ask cross-ex questions. It's also important to understand why we have cross-ex to make sure that you use it to the best of your ability. Cross-ex is a super valuable time. Even though 3 minutes between every constructive speech does not seem like much time, it's important. This time is important for you to ask questions that help you better understand the other team's arguments. For example, if someone is reading an affirmative that mentions the 1033 program and you're unfamiliar, you may want to ask, what is the 1033 program and how do you plan to change it? And if they can't explain what the program, and they can't explain that the program intends to transfer military equipment to police departments and around the US, and then they can explain that their policy proposal is to eliminate the program. Specifically, asking certain questions allows you to set up strategy which leads you into your next speech. Cross-ex is valuable to help you build the strategy because even though it's a more complex way to think about these 3 minutes, it's an important way to understand how you should ask questions as you get better at debate, as you continue debating. Also, we have cross-ex for many reasons when it comes to how well you debate or determining your speaker points. And cross-ex has benefits just writ large. First is that it allows you to show that you can answer questions that your opponent asks you. When your argument withstands questioning, you're able to prove that it's credible and that you can explain it. And when you have a more in-depth understanding of your argument, it reflects on you better as a debater. This is also distinct from having a gotcha moment, which proves that even when your opponent tries to push you, you are able to explain your argument best. Also, having cross-ex gives you time outside of reading pre-written speeches or reading cards or extending arguments to show your personality. If you're sassy or funny or able to command a room, or you're really quiet but you're actually smart as well, you are doing more than giving a pre-written speech, which allows you to show that you have other traits in a debate that are valuable that may not be able to be shared at other points of the debate.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about some do's and don'ts of asking cross-ex questions, right? Your opponent has finished their speech and it's your turn to go up and ask them some questions, right? Engage in cross-ex, and here are some things you definitely should do. So first is ask questions, don't make arguments, right? So it's important that you use cross-examination to get your opponents to explain their arguments more, and ideally in a way that exposes any flaws in their logic or their argumentation. You also can use this time to ask questions that you think sets up some sort of argument of your own. So cross-examination is time for you to gain clarity on the opponent's argument, but also bring some parts of the policy to the attention of the judge, right? Because if I'm a judge and I'm sitting and watching a debate, and you have an opportunity to influence how I perceive arguments, then you want to ask questions that kind of make my mind go in that direction and start thinking about problems with what they just said in their last speech, or I can help also identify flaws in their arguments, which will help you later on in the debate. So, for example, if someone is defending a policy that seeks to divest federal investment in police departments, you may ask, why is divestment of federal funds significant if state and local governments are still funding police departments? This question seeks to question the effectiveness of the policy at hand, right? So though that argument is setting up an argument that you might want to make, right, about how the policy proposal is insufficient to resolve the problem the team is mentioning, you want to try to bring that to the judge's attention by asking that question. And you don't want to just make the argument that's like, why would you even read this proposal when state and local governments are going to keep funding it, right? You just want to ask the simple question of why is the policy sufficient? Let them answer, and then use their answer to craft your argument later on in the debate. The second thing is you want to establish the basic premises for your later arguments. So a premise is basically an underlying claim that serves to support a conclusion. It is a claim that someone understands to be true in the process of constructing an argument. So if my logical train of thought, right, is that first, all cats are blue. Second, Joe is a cat. therefore Joe is blue, right? The claim that all cats are blue is a premise. That can be true or false. In this case, it's not true, but it is one of those things you're assuming to be true in your logical train of thought to come to some sort of conclusion. So whenever you're engaging in cross-ex and you're trying to come to some sort of argument later on in the debate, you might use cross-ex to set up just one of those premises so that you can articulate your conclusion later. You definitely should use the time to establish these premises for later arguments so that when you bring up an argument in your speech about like how criminal justice reform is politically contentious, right? Maybe in cross-ex you want to ask who in government supports your policy. It would be an inquiry about the team's general position, but also helps you phrase your argument in later speeches, especially if the other team is unable to quickly and accurately answer that question. Right? If you ask who in government supports your policy and the other team can't explain it, it gives you more leverage later in the round to say, this is who supports it, or this is who doesn't support it, and talk about how the policy interacts with politics. Right? So it gives you an opportunity to introduce that sort of discussion into the debate. And the third thing is, that you want to do in cross-ex is, do you identify things that do not make sense to you? If something doesn't make sense and you want to use cross-ex to clarify the argument the other team has made, because it's always important to know what is happening in the debate. And that sounds somewhat obvious, but many times teams may introduce arguments you're unfamiliar with or maybe discuss laws that you haven't heard about before. So if it will influence the debate, you want to make sure that you are aware of what those things are and how they will implicate the debate later on before you move on. So those are things you should do. Now, things that you don't want to do in cross-ex is allow your opponents to ramble. You don't want to give your opponents opportunities to grandstand on their arguments and say whatever they want and talk about how great the arguments are, right? And just give them all that time. If I ask a broad question like, why should you win the debate? It gives the opponent basically more speech time to explain to the judge why they should win. Now, instead, you want to ask specific questions that don't give the other team too much flexibility to say whatever they please. Obviously, this isn't like super easy, but the way to constrain that is to be careful of open-ended questions. So if it is possible, attempt to phrase questions in a way that only allow for a couple words or one or two word answers. This can include yes or no questions, right? So maybe the question is, which branch of the government would implement the policy you are defending? And that sort of question requires only simple answers like the legislative branch, the executive branch, or the judicial branch. And they don't have time to explain why they think that branch is better than another branch. They just have to answer the question. Now, the second thing you don't want to do is use all of your time to ask your opponent to repeat their arguments or restate their argument in their own words. So cross-ex is valuable speech time, like we've mentioned before. It provides you an opportunity to pick apart things they've said before, and so you can respond to them. So you don't want to waste it. So during a speech, if you hear something that sounds questionable, suspicious, or incorrect, you should take note of it and remember to come back to it during cross-ex. You might want to write it down on a piece of paper. And so a related note, right, is to don't forget to prepare for cross-ex, right? Like you always want to make sure you're taking notes during the speech. It's not an ad lib, right? In some ways you get to kind of go with the flow and naturally ask more questions, but you always want to have one or two questions prepared before cross-ex that you know you want to ask. And then when you ask them, you want to make sure it's not simply, can you repeat this argument, but you know, what is the implication of this argument, or why do you believe this is true?
So equally as important as asking cross-ex questions, your ability to answer cross-ex questions is also super important to make sure that you display who you are as a debater. There are a few do's and a few don'ts when it comes to answering cross-ex questions. The first thing that is important to do when you answer a question is to answer the question as clearly and concisely as possible. There's a lot of reasons why this is important. The first is that it's really easy to avoid answering a question if you don't want to answer a question. But that hurts your credibility and your speaker points and harms the way that people understand your argument. So, for example, if you don't understand the way that a question is worded or don't understand the reason why your opponent is even asking a question in the first place, you can ask them to repeat or rephrase their question. However, if you do this after every single question as a way to stall to give you time to think of an answer, or as a way to avoid answering a question, that defeats the purpose of having a debate in the first place. That's why it's important to answer the question when you're asked it as clearly and concisely as possible. However, if you don't immediately know an answer to the question, you can take some time. You can pause to think of an answer, or you can ask your opponent to come back to that question later if you need to find a piece of evidence that you can't find quickly enough while they're asking for an answer from you. It's also important when you answer cross-ex questions to reference the evidence that you have read in a debate. When you answer cross-ex questions, you are defending your argument at its core, which means that not only are you answering questions based off of what you may know, just like off the top of your head, but you're most importantly answering cross-ex questions based off of what your cards say and what your argument says. So when you answer questions, it's important to reference back to pieces of evidence you have read later in the debate, or reference back to points that you made in previous speeches or points that your partner made in previous speeches. So when you answer questions that are based around evidence, for example, someone asks you like what your solvency advocate is for your counterplan, you can reference back to your piece of evidence. They'll say let's say Ashton wrote this piece of evidence. Our Smith evidence from 2020 says that our counterplan solves, and then you explain why or what the evidence says to prove that the counterplan solves. Like we talked about earlier in the week, when you extend evidence, you extend based off of the author and the year, a tag, and the warrant after that, because you need to remember that the basis of an argument is a claim, and the warrant and the impact that that warrant has. There are, however, things that you should not do while answering cross-ex questions. The first is that you shouldn't beat around the bush. Similar to what Ashton said earlier in the presentation, beating around the bush is annoying for the judge to hear and defeats the purpose of debate writ large. If you filibuster or speak endlessly, assuming that the person asking questions won't cut you off, you're able to over-explain your argument, but that might hurt you later on. It's important to answer a question to the extent that you think you need to answer it, which means if someone cuts you off, you can ask them to wait a little bit longer so you can finish answering your question. However, over-explaining your argument or just talking for the sake of talking reflects poorly on you and may actually hurt your argument in the long run. Ashton will talk more about why this is important or how you stand that ground later on in the presentation. Also, at the end of the day, you shouldn't make up answers to cross-ex questions. Again, because when you answer your questions, they're based on the evidence that you've read or the arguments that you've made earlier in the debate. So making up answers either may contradict your argument or may writ large just make your argument look weak. I think that debaters struggle with this, but it's important to know that you can say, I don't know, to a answer or a question that your opponent may ask you. Because cross-ex isn't a flowed speech. While it's binding insofar as what you say is something that an opponent can bring up in a speech later, you're still able to go back and clarify answers or reinterpret things that you have said. So cross-ex is important. It's okay to say I don't know, and it's okay to clarify things later on in the debate, as long as you make sure that you stay true to the argument that you made in the first place earlier on in the debate.
All right, and the last major section is about decorum and etiquette. All right, so about how to behave during cross-ex. How someone acts during cross-ex is important. There are many different ways to engage in cross-ex. There's not like one way to do it correctly. People have different ways to present themselves, right, to be convincing, different approaches, and that's all fine. But there are some things we want to note of engaging in cross-ex to make sure that everyone enjoys the experience, right? It's something that's interesting, and it doesn't turn into kind of just like a shouting match or uncomfortable for the judge to witness. So because cross-ex is something that includes talking from both teams as opposed to most speeches, sometimes it's possible that one person might talk over the other, or cross-ex may get a little bit heated when there are people who disagree about something that's super important. But even though everyone is committed to their arguments and everyone wants to win, we want to make sure that that passion is expressed respectfully. So, especially in a world of digital debate, there are things to keep in mind to make sure cross-ex goes smoothly. Over platforms like Zoom, if two people are speaking at one time, the app just prioritizes one of those voices based off of whatever factors it uses, and someone just won't be heard at all. So even when going into debate over digital platforms, you want to be aware of that and make sure that everyone's being heard, especially if you want someone to answer your questions. So when I give these comments, remember that cross-ex and one person is assigned to ask questions and the other should answer. So make sure that everyone keeps that in mind. If you are answering questions, give your opponent the opportunity to articulate their question fully before you try to answer. And if you're asking questions, try to let your opponent answer the question before you ask the next question. This is the ideal. However, there are times when it's not so simple. Cross-ex, in fact, is a timed speech. So sometimes you want to speed up the answer or skip a question entirely if you realize that it's taking way too much time to get your question answered. Or maybe you're in the middle of answering cross-ex questions and the opponent wants to cut you off before you said something that you think is really important for the judge to hear. So I'll talk about some ways to make sure that askers and answers can resolve these issues in real time. First, interjecting or moving on, right? So when you are asking cross-ex questions, you want to make sure that you are getting to the questions you have prepared. And you may want to interject and keep the examination going. To do so, while the other person is talking, you can say words like, excuse me, or sorry, hold on, to signal to the other debater that you would like them to stop talking. Those aren't the only phrases, right? Each person will have their own method, but you want to say it in a way that's not like, be quiet, I have another question, right? I trust that you all have manners, so make sure that those are reflected in those debates, and you're not just shutting someone down, but trying to show to the judge and the opponent, I have another question, let's keep it going. If someone keeps talking, you are allowed to just ask the next question. You can say, I have another question, pause for just a second to give them time to wrap up what they're saying, or also to signal like I'm moving on, and then ask your next question, right? If you are clearly signaling that you want to move on and a judge sees that, they will listen to the question you've asked and they'll just wait for the opponents to respond. And if the opponent refuses to answer that question, or they keep talking about the one you moved on from, that reflects poorly on them, right? They lose some ethos, right? They lose some credibility in the round, and then they also might lose some speaker points. However, if you try to move on too quickly, judges are sometimes inclined to continue listening to your opponents until they finish answering the question. So if I ask the question of how does eliminating the 1033 program resolve this harm, right? And you give the opponent 3 seconds to answer, and then, or I give the opponent 3 seconds to answer, and then I'm like, all right, I have another question. The judge might not be too happy, and they'll be listening to the opponent's argument and their explanation to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. Now, the second thing is ensuring you're heard, right? And this is about coming from the perspective of someone who is answering questions, right? If you think that someone is not letting you be heard in cross-ex, it is okay to be assertive, right? You can say things like, let me answer your question. Or like what you want to avoid is letting cross-ex turn into a screaming match. So remember, speaker points are a thing in debate. And what cross-ex does influence how you're perceived as a speaker. So be clear and assertive, but don't get drawn into the shouting, right? So you can still calmly indicate like, let me answer your question, right? And continue your answer, especially if they're not letting you finish your answers. As I mentioned before, judges are likely to listen to you when they see that the opponent is talking over you frequently. Right, so these are just some ways to keep in mind that how you engage in cross-ex, right? Though sometimes it's heated, right? You might watch other film or like maybe more examples like what we saw earlier, right? Where people just talk over each other, right? That question and answer format can escalate, but there are ways that you can interject to make sure you're heard just by speaking up, standing your ground, and making sure that you're clearly articulating what you have to say. So that's what we had to say today about cross-examination. We hope that you got something out of it. It's more clear to you how to engage in that. And you can ask questions as to us or your lab leaders, right, in your labs if you have more questions about doing cross-ex. I guess my last note is it's an experience thing, right? Cross-ex is something you get better at just by doing it. So in your first couple debates, if you're not great at cross-ex, it's totally fine. You'll get used to it.
Absolutely. I was terrible at cross-ex as a novice, and you get better at it because the more comfortable you get with your arguments and the speeches, the easier it is to show who you are and reflect your arguments in debate.
Exactly. Have a nice day.